Okay, thank you. Thank you, everybody. We got a small but mighty crowd, and I know that we'll get more in because my students told me they would be here. I want to introduce myself and then our guest speaker today. Oh, here we go. So my name is Judy Walgren. I'm a faculty member of photography here at Foothill College. Thankfully, I'm so happy to be here. And I have the extreme honor of getting to introduce Rosem Morton, who is an incredible person, first of all, and also an amazing documentary photographer who hails from the Philippines, right? Her work focuses on daily life and centers around gender, health, and racial adversity. She is a National Geographic Explorer and an IWMF, or International Women's Foundation Fellow. And her work explores a diverse range of issues surrounding the effects of gender-based violence, the unheard stories of healthcare workers, from which she can speak to firsthand in both cases. And also the forgotten histories, right, that have shaped Filipino culture and migration. And before we started, I was talking to her about, I live very close to Daly City here, and we were talking about the vets, the Filipino veterans who did not receive benefits that Jackie Spear, our senator, really works and is still working hard to get. Rosem has written and photographed stories for National Geographic, the Washington Post, the NPR, CNN. Her projects have been awarded by the World Press Photo 6x6 talent and the Pictures of the Year International, all huge honors for photographers and especially documentary photographers. And she was also one of the 30 new and emerging photographers to watch. She also is a big part of a book I'm writing with our colleague Tara Pixley on the decolonization of photojournalism. And Rosem's work features heavily in the visual ethics chapter and also on trauma and safety and how to stay safe. She just shared with me that she'll probably be coming out this summer to do a safety training, hopefully with the IWMF, and I'll send out information about that if I'm able to, as we get more information. Her ongoing personal project, one which I'm very just near and dear to as well, is Wildflower. Wildflower is the recipient of the Leica Women Photo Award and the Vies d'Or Daily Press Award. Again, two huge ones. And she founded Dear Survivor, which is a powerful audiovisual resource for survivors of gender and sexual-based violence. And it's been supported by We Women Photo. This talk in and of itself is sponsored by Foothill College's Office of Student Affairs and Activities, and it's brought to you in honor of Asian and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. So with that, it's a lot. I hope I kept you all with me. Welcome, Rosem, and we're really looking forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you, Judith. That was a very, very sweet and generous introduction. I'm really happy to be here, happy to share my work with you all. So let me share my screen here. All right. So I guess the best way to really get to know me is through my work. It wasn't really intentional, but over time, my personal work became a reflection of every facet of my life and all of the themes I deeply care about. So today, my work is divided into three buckets. One is on the gender and sexual-based violence. The other one is on the Filipino diaspora. And the third one is on the preservation of Filipino culture through the relationship with the land and the sea. So today, hopefully with time, I'll be speaking on all of those three topics. So I want to start off with a content warning. For those who may not be aware, my work on gender and sexual-based violence is heavy and emotional. And so I just want you to know that it's okay to feel these intense emotions, and I encourage you to do whatever you need to take care of yourself, whether it be to take deep breaths, to step outside, to turn off your camera, or maybe to lean into it or put it aside for later. Just know that all of those things are absolutely valid and okay. So first and foremost, I was born and raised in Manila. I like to share a picture of my mom because she made great sacrifices to be able to bring her family to the US. She took extra degrees and switched jobs so she could be a special ed teacher. knowing that it was one of the pathways that would allow her to bring her family to the US. So I moved to the US right before college, and I became a nurse, which is a field very ingrained in Filipino culture. More on that later. But I wanted a career that was about helping people, and I wanted to show, the appreciation for my migration. So I followed the nursing path for many years until I felt the repetitive nature of burnout surfacing. And this is where kind of photography came in, and I started to wonder if I could make a career out of photography. So I learned about photojournalism workshops and figured it was the great way to gauge if this was really a career for me. And in order to be in a workshop, you have to have work. So this was actually one of the first stories that I made. This is on a home birth story of Cham, who actually went to the same school I did in the Philippines and lived in Michigan. So she gave me a call that she was in labor, and I drove from Maryland to Michigan and made it to the very, very lovely home birth. So, however, this was also the summer that I was trying to pursue storytelling, and this was when I was sexually assaulted. So the projects about other people became a project about myself. And photography became my attempt to make sense of the devastation by confronting the pain head on and finding a way to live. This photo in particular was when I had a phone call with the assaulter who was trying to kind of blame me for the experience, and I had crashed my car in the garage, and these are the pieces of glass from my side mirror. So this was a letter that I had detailed out the details of my assault for my then partner when he was ready. I also named this project Wildflower based on wildflowers I saw blooming and thriving despite the dark. And at the time, I could not imagine that for myself. And I could only hope to endure. Trauma changes you. It creates all these ripple effects to everyone you're connected with. There's been kind of major fallouts with family and friends trying to confront this trauma head on, trying to be quite vocal about it. But it is a path that I've chosen and I've continued on. And, I also understand that I'm still healing, and it ebbs and flows throughout the years. And as this project kind of continues to grow with me. But despite all of this, I feel really compelled to share this experience because, at the time I felt like I had nothing else to lose. And imagining the devastation experienced by so many people was just unacceptable to me. So sharing my story and my photographs continues to be both challenging and draining, but I also learned so much. I became a more sensitive storyteller. I became passionate about trauma and education, and I've learned what it's like to be on both ends of the camera. And also the ripple effects of sharing a story publicly. The insight and the growth was really, really invaluable. And I think, once you bear it all, you could just no longer live in the shadows. And I had no choice but to live my most authentic self. So vulnerability creates a lot of vulnerability. So after sharing my story, a lot of people confided with me about theirs. So I ended up starting this project called Dear Survivor. So it started off as a diptych series of where one side is a portrait of a survivor, and then the other is their means of coping. So this is Kelly. At the time that I met her, she was in rehab for a stroke that she had a miraculous recovery from. She has a lot of bracelets that talk about her survivor journey, and she was trafficked at a really, really young age and has experienced many devastating events, and yet she still is such an incredibly strong and inspiring person. and really coped with creating a lot of different artwork. And then, of course, as I asked other people to do this project with me, I do the same for myself. So this is me. This is a self-portrait, and a note about how I start walking around the house wearing a blanket, and I realize now how much anxiety I have, and it lives on the undercurrents of my skin. I struggle to self-soothe, so I wear this blanket instead. This is Dana. She is a survivor of child sexual abuse, and at the time that I met her, she wrote her story for court and had reported her assault, and is kind of facing all of kind of the familial backlash that comes with that. And this project, you know, has a lot of variations where people can show their face, people can have, you know, whatever it is that feels like a portrait to them. So Christy here, her portrait is her painting, and the means of coping is outdoor walks that she really enjoys. And then this is Lindsay, who is a writer in New York, and it is, she writes very, very beautifully. It's hard for me to see it right now as I share the screen to share with you the full her full statement, because my face is blocking it. But she is really talking about how this journey doesn't define her, and she is not her pain, but a joyous woman. So this project really started right before the pandemic, and the pandemic taught me to really pivot with it. So I ended up creating this online website because I really wanted a community engagement piece with this project. So then it became a website with resources. I started a podcast, all of these things. And this is a project that I hopefully I'm applying for funding this year to really expand more, maybe throughout the US or even maybe globally. So fingers crossed. Yeah, but again, the pandemic happened, unfortunately, and you know, it put me in this unique position both as a photojournalist and a nurse. So I started documenting my journey as a nurse during the initial months of the pandemic. This was another moment for me to use photography to make sense of an event and offer an inside look of what it's like to be in a hospital. This is on the right. So on the left was me saving my masks at that time. And then on the right is just OR humor when things got crazy. People, we still try to be silly about it. And then I, within this project, I also shared a little bit of home life, of isolation, infused with kind of the daily tension. So I'm going to read, I used to also obsessively write down how many confirmed cases were in Maryland. So this was my first journal entry, which was on March 17, 2020, Tuesday, workday number 1. Days since confirmed case of coronavirus in Maryland, 12. And days since first known coronavirus patient was admitted to the hospital where I work is 6. It seems so crazy now, looking back, but I say 6 a.m. as I scramble to leave for work. I realize my routine has changed. My lunchbox is replaced by a plastic bag. I used to carry a glass container, a cloth napkin, metal utensils, and a water bottle. And I cringe at the waste from single-use plastics, but I tell myself minimizing items I bring home lessens the risk for everyone. I leave behind my purse and stuff my pockets with my badge, scissors, and pen. You know, I arrive at work before sunrise, and the main rotating door is closed. In front of it is a sign reading COVID response, showing new rules that limit entry to the hospital. Hospital employees form a silent line, spaced for social distancing, to filter through the side door. Today is one of the last days I would call business as usual. While much of the administrative staff has moved to working remotely, everyone else is still here. So it's quite a long thing, but every photo that I had a caption like that, of a timestamp of where I was at work, how many people we were taking care of. And it really contextualized a lot of like the anxiety of that time coming in. And this was also the time I also started thinking about, my Filipino nursing colleagues. I realized that there were no long-term stories of Filipino American nurses, and our lives were also simplified through statistics and stereotypes. By the summer of 2020, so Filipino nurses only make up 4% of the US population of nurses. So it's not a very big number, but by the summer of 2020, 31.5% of nurses who passed away from COVID in the US were Filipino. So again, it was a very astounding number. At the time, nobody was reporting on it. And the narrative often attached to this community was that we moved to America to better our lives. And although that's the truth, it's not the only truth. So this led me to this project, which really talked about the history of why there's so many Filipino nurses in America. So the current nursing practice in the Philippines was actually established during the US colonization of our country. So they restricted this role to be only for women. So this was kind of the first nursing school that was established in the US. Let me kind of paraphrase that this project ended up being using archival photos and present day photos to kind of link this historical tie. So they established uniforms, they feminized the profession, they taught it in English. So they showed us that advancement can only happen if there was education or work experience in the US. So in reality, this kind of prepared and attracted Filipinos to become nurses abroad instead of their home country. So this is kind of there was a nurse in the 50s and 60s who actually documented her journey to the Philippines, which I think is amazing that this exists. So this was the boat, and this was her first hospital, I believe, in Ohio, which is really amazing to have gotten this. And then over time, this says Hong Kong, so this is kind of the future. More and more Filipinos started funneling here to the US. So they made a stop in Hong Kong. So after World War II, the US created programs to attract skilled workers, which began the first wave of Filipino nursing immigrants. So I think it's really important to understand that not only did we migrate to better our lives, but these countries needed us as well, and that we are historically shaped to be here. So as I mentioned earlier, I paired the archival images with present-day portraits and present-day images to connect the past with the present. And I also followed 5 families in their homes to kind of show life beyond the hospital. So a lot of the editors were interested in the nursing identity within the hospital and all of the deaths and the destruction that we were seeing. But I also kind of wanted to show that, they're moms and they have families and their aunts and their fathers and all of these things. So I wanted to challenge them, because being a nurse is not the only thing that defines them. So Filipino nurses have often been, represented as faceless statistics as an answer to understaffed hospitals. So my hope is to really highlight their contributions by showing their lives and their sacrifices as they continue to contribute to the overall wellness of the country. And of course, the coverage of Filipino Americans would not be complete without recognizing the work of Filipino frontline health workers in New York. So New York at the time was one of the worst hit areas, where, especially when we had very little knowledge about the virus, and we had extreme shortages in PPE. So this was also an area where one in 4 Filipinos work in healthcare. So I ended up doing this portrait project where it's doctors, nurses, physical therapists, respiratory therapists. It's really everyone. And then I paired it with an anecdote of their experiences there. So this is Jonah Caparas. I'll read her anecdote. So the heartache and helplessness I felt when my own brother was brought to the hospital was like no other. He was found passed out in his driveway and was diagnosed with a subarachnoid bleed and tested positive for COVID. All I could do was get updates because I couldn't leave my patients who were also dying and needed lines so they could survive. My brother died 2 days later. And around that time, 5 of my friends died as well. And after my brother died, things took a toll on me. I was crying, my glasses were fogging while I was trying to insert lines. And it was tough. And of course, patients were dying in front of you. And that was the most difficult time for me. And it's still difficult. I think one of the privileges of being able to do this project was really being able to speak the same language as everyone in this project, and also not just Filipino language, Tagalog, but also just the language of healthcare. So a lot of them, this was really their first time openly talking about their experiences, because most of them never really want to bring it home. So a lot of the trauma during COVID was really, really compartmentalized. And of course, they were also just happy to be recognized in their work. And this is Jane. So she's actually an assistant director in nursing. So she's actually in management. So overnight, she had managed a endoscopy unit. So when you get scoped for GI things, but overnight they turned her unit into an ICU. And so she had to not only be a leader, but to be a bedside nurse and educate her staff at the same time, because she was the only one who had ER experience. And then at the end of it, her administration asked her, "How did you do it?" She says, "I didn't do it. My staff did it because there was no other way but to do it and to survive." So shortly before the pandemic, I was also photographing fishermen in the Philippines. I wanted to highlight the rising tensions in the South China Sea that you may or may not know that is happening right now. So this is kind of a rough map of Southeast Asia. The one in orange is the Philippines. So the right next to the Philippines is the West Philippine Sea, which kind of filters into South China Sea. And as you can see in the bottom part, Scarborough Shoal, Tito Island, and Second Thomas Shoal are islands that are actually owned by the Philippines, but are now heavily patrolled by Chinese militia. And in 2022, you can see pretty much the rest of the year, they've been patrolling it. So Scarborough Shoal kind of was the initial starting point for this project, because I photographed it leading up to the 10 years that there was a standoff where a large Chinese vessel had parked itself here at Scarborough Shoal and started water bombing all of these fishermen, and have essentially kicked them out from this very, very lucrative area for fishing. And since then, they've had a UN arbitrary about who owns this area, which the Philippines had won, but have not successfully done anything to forcibly remove them from the area. So I wanted to follow the fishermen to see how they're surviving without that area. So this photo right here is just them fishing in kind of municipal waters, trying to make ends meet month to month because of everything that happened. And you see here that, they're just working with very small boats in the middle of the ocean, trying to fish to survive for their families. And they really have no way to fight against a kind of heavy militarized vessel. It was very hard for me to get that story published. I ended up never getting that story published. It ended up being exhibited in the Philippines. But it did lead me to a second part of this project where Tito Island, that's been patrolled by China for the last 208 days, is actually the only island in this area that is inhabited by non-military people in the Philippines. So my story now kind of covered this island, Situ, and how people have become the symbol of resistance for the Chinese militia, because they are essentially, the Philippine government is using incentivizing civilians to continue to live there, to establish sovereignty in the area. Yeah, sorry, it's like I'm kind of so as you can see, this area has both militia and civilians who live there, and all of these boats at the coast are all Chinese vessels that surround the area. So local fishermen have reported instances of harassment, cyanide fishing, that both affect their livelihood. A lot of them don't fish far away from the island anymore because they have been bullied. And there's been a back and forth between the Philippine government, depending on who is president, of how honest they can be about what is happening in this area right now. But there are more and more incursions. I think just in November, they've had 10 incursions of getting water bombed by Chinese vessels. So again, these people are now on the forefront of the issues in South China Sea right now. And also, it's an island that's very difficult to live in the first place. So these are all coconut trees that are cut from a terrible typhoon in 2021. So half of the island is also decimated and still rebuilding because of that. So it is kind of a challenging issue, and a lot of the images in the area of South China Sea are always like these highly militarized vessels, and I really wanted to put a face of how that trickle down geopolitical event really affects people on the ground. So yeah, kind of to wrap up, it's been an honor to witness all these incredible and powerful stories. My experiences, both good and bad, so many years in the making, have helped shape me to respond to the stories around me. And I hope that in sharing my experience, you can walk away embracing, ups and downs and the many skills and experiences of that journey. Because I think, my background in nursing and led me to photography, to led me to talking about all of these different things, kind of really, really shaped my journey. And that's something I definitely want to encourage students in leaning towards as well.
Rosem, thank you so much. And I always learn, right? Every time I talk to you or read anything written about you, and about your processes. You do so much for so many people. So I hope you have the same support system back there somewhere. Question from a student, Jonathan. He's asking, was your career path of nursing partly inspired by the history of Filipino American nurses, or did you only learn about the role of Filipino Americans in the medical field after you started your career?
My career path was inspired by culturally, as like there's a lot of Filipinos who are Filipino nurses, who are nurses, but not the historical ties that I learned later on. And it's actually, the crazy part about that is if you ask most Filipino nurses, they also didn't know. So my project was not only teaching other people about us, it was also teaching Filipinos that this is actually why we're here, which was very, very fascinating for all of us. That's a great question. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jonathan. Anyone else? I've got millions, but I would like for people that haven't engaged with you before to go first. Anybody else? Neela's asking, do you travel back and forth to document the story, or do you stay there for long extended periods of time? I was going to ask the same question, Neela.
I travel back and forth, so I would stay there probably like a month to 2 months at a time. Yes.
How did you get connected to the people on the island in the first place? Like, did you just show up there and say, hi, I know about you, I want to do this story? Or like, how did that work?
That's a great question because it was a journey. So because their island is so remote, like their mayor and all of that stuff live in like closer to the Philippines, so like on a different main island. So I had to talk to all of the mayor's office, and then I actually, because that area, the only way to get to that area is through a local government vessel that only goes there twice a year, or a military plane. So I actually had to go all the way to the Department of Defense, send a bunch of paperwork, meet everyone from every branch of military in the Philippines. So it took a long time. I think it was about 4 months of trying to get access. It was a long time. It's probably the hardest access I've ever been able to do in my life.
And so then you get the access, but then how do the people living there actually embrace you or not? Like, how long did it take for you to kind of mesh with the people living there?
Actually, very quickly. I think because they rarely see people, like they've had like media come in like for like 6 hours, but I had planned to stay there a significant period of time, which I think had already like allowed them to, oh, this is a person actually really interested in our story. So that was really nice. I also ended up, I think they were, because I had made arrangements through the government, they were trying to get me to sleep in the government area, like in the military barracks. And I had really pushed back and said I really wanted to do a homestay in the community. And I think that also really endeared me to them, because no one had actually stayed in their community before. It was really an outsider perspective, part of the military. They visit and then they leave. So I think showing how much I wanted to be embedded really helped.
Yeah, interesting. Kate Yordahl, our esteemed professor, asks, can you talk more about the caring of your nursing? I love this question. And the caring of photographic documentation. And like, how do your parallel communication skills help each of your vocations? I like that.
Oh, that's really
Thanks, Kate.
I actually often talk about how parallel nursing and journalism is, where you're doing careers that are in service of other people, whether it be a witness to their story or is a witness to their physical pain or health ailment. So I think really the best way to really communicate is to humanize yourself and humanize them, and really get to know them as a person first, and not the trauma, not the pain, not the story, just the individual first. So I do try to do that as best as I can, and find ways to connect with them, because I think regardless of any person on the street, right, we can always find things that we can connect with, whether it be having a dog, having children, going to a certain school. Like, I think we can always find ways to connect with each other. And nursing has taught me that, journalism has taught me that as well.
Yeah, that's a great comparison. It's just that calling, that people have, I think. Thank you for a great question, Kate. Student Harry asks, what's your next project? Do you have one?
Oh, my next project is the Dear Survivor project. I'm hoping to kind of get more funding to really expand that. Hoping to make it into like a story map where I'm not the only contributor of the work, so that the people who have already done work of the same kind can just be connected to this website, and you can also pin it around the US, around the world. That's kind of the lofty goal.
Oh, very cool. So it'll be on expanding that and getting the funding for that.
Mhm.
Yeah, love to help you with that somehow. Thanks a lot, Harry. Neela has a good question. What kind of camera gear do you use, especially for your portraits of the people on the island and for the nurses? Because it definitely had its own look to it. So what kind of gear, lenses, camera bodies are you using?
I use a
Lighting.
Canon. Oh yeah, I use a Canon R6. I use primes. I have a 35, I think it's a Sigma 35. I have a Canon 50, and then I have a Sigma 24. So those are kind of my main workhorse. And then I do a lot of the portraits with my 50. I don't use lighting. I kind of do, yeah, everything is natural light, especially the portraits. And then I tried to meet, at least the ones in New York, I tried to meet them roughly around the same time so that there's some consistency with the light. But yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. I was sure at least one of those was lit, and I was like, oh, I want to know what she's using for that. I mean, do you use a reflector or anything, or is it just, oh my God, well done.
Yeah.
Um, okay, I have a question until I
Mhm.
start seeing some red things show up there in the chat or the Q&A. So how did you get the data about the Filipino nurses dying from COVID, like the 32% of that is very disturbing data. And what was that attributed to, right? Not getting the same level of support with PPE or being, I'm curious if you found anything else out about that.
Yeah, so I believe it was like National League of Nursing. So
Mm,
they sent out the numbers early in COVID. So that was the 30% in 2020. And then in 2021, the number shifted as more people had passed. So it actually was a lot less. I think it became 28% or something like that, but it was still a significant number. So there's a couple of discussion points as to why that was. First and foremost, like a lot of Filipino healthcare workers work the acute roles, so they
yeah.
usually work in ER, ICU. They work in the nursing homes and things like that. They usually live in intergenerational households, so the likelihood of getting sick is a lot more. They also usually have multiple nurses in their family, so just even the likelihood of getting people sick was a lot higher. And then also just, the immigrant experience of keeping your head down, of like not complaining if there's no PPE, if you're exposed, you keep working, things like that. Especially in New York, a lot of the people I worked with, they actively had COVID and were forced to go to work because there was just no other choice. So I think just being overworked, already sick with COVID, still treating a lot of COVID patients, it was just kind of a recipe for disaster in a lot of different ways, which was really, really sad.
Yeah, it's like an awful perfect storm, awful one. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
thank you for elaborating on that. I'm going to ask another question. Are you still working actively as a nurse? And you might have said this, but maybe I missed it. But are you still working as a nurse? Are you working primarily as a documentary photographer or visual storyteller? What is your, or are you kind of like doing all of it?
I was doing all of it from when COVID started up until end of 2022. So I'm no longer practicing nurse as of the end of 2022. So
Mm,
yeah. It was also, I thought I could sustain it for a lot longer, but it really was not a sustainable thing to do both at the same time. It would just lead to extreme burnout, which which I really sped up my exit, and I'm grateful for it because I got a chance to really also think about my own mental health.
mm-hmm. And then another question is, how do you get funding? Like when you say I'm looking for funding, or are you getting funding? Are you being hired for media outlets and making money that way? Are you writing grants? Like how do you support yourself in your work? I think I'm really curious.
Yeah, I kind of diversify my income just so I support myself. Right now, I support myself through getting, freelance assignments for different newspapers. I also do a lot of teaching, as you mentioned earlier. I do safety trainings for journalists, hopefully more student journalists, as the current times are changing. I do that. I also do some freelance writing. So those have kind of helped me, but specifically for projects, I've pretty much funded a lot of my projects through grant work. So I do spend a lot of time writing and applying for grants. I have been very fortunate to have gotten a grant a year. So that's
Wow.
that's my kind of goal, is to continue to do that. But I also always tell people, like, a grant a year is kind of surprising and amazing, but that also means I am applying to a lot. People probably apply to less than 5 a year. I apply to 10 or more. So it is a very aggressive game for me, but it gives me so much freedom in the kinds of story I want to tell, because I pretty much all of my projects, I use grant funding, I finish them, and I give it to a publisher in like a finished form. So I get a lot of control, which I'm really, really happy about. Because again, like, for a lot of the sensitive topics, because especially like the most recent grant I got was for the South China Sea one, the last story I shared. That one, like, a lot of news outlets do not believe that this is happening. So I really had to, like, finish out the project and make sure that the people I'm giving to, like, understand like all of the nuances and will allow me to be able to explain that as well. Yeah.
Who's going to publish that? Like you said that it hadn't been published yet. I was shocked.
Oh, the first part was not.
Oh,
So
okay.
the second part, with the island, ended up publishing in Wall Street Journal, which seems like an odd an odd choice for me. But the photo editor was Filipino and really kind of helped me in the back end to really advocate for that story, which was great. Yeah.
That's interesting, right? And that's kind of what it takes, right? That gatekeeping, kind of not being from a Western white perspective all the time, right? Like that's been the legacy of media, right? The gatekeeper coming from a certain perspective. So that, thank you for offering that. Does anybody else have another question? Because I got another one. Okay, so I was curious if you could talk a little bit more about this incredible safety training that you have devised, which is it's it's like the DART training, which is the kind of the one that it's super militarized and people know about in the field of journalism, but it's not, right? Like I didn't realize how much room there was for you to do your thing to it. So I was curious about the safety training and how you came up with your protocol.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make
So
sense?
yeah, I think it makes
Okay.
sense. And then if I don't answer it correctly, you could just re-ask me the question. So in, I think, 2021, there was the International Women's Media Foundation. They recognized that there were no safety trainers outside from white ex-military men who have devised these safety trainings for journalists. But because of their background, it was really geared for people who only enter war zones, and they're not really acknowledging all of the nuances to be a photojournalist, where your identity is at risk, safety is defined by so many things, and all of these different factors. So we ended up having kind of a fellowship where we're having discussions on how do we redefine this. So coming out of that fellowship, me, Tara, and a couple of colleagues were really talking about safety, and we wanted a identity aware and trauma sensitive training moving forward. So we really kind of highlight about how your identity really affects your safety. And And this is something that we unconsciously do all the time already as we move through the world. And how can we infuse that when we plan our risk assessments, when we plan for safety, when we plan going to protests, and how we navigate all of these things, how we de-escalate. So all of these things now we're kind of trying to infuse in these trainings. So IWMF, who started the fellowship, I work for them on a freelance basis and do these trainings, and which is one that's coming in, I believe, in July in California, in your area. But there's no official dates yet and things like that. And then Tara, I and my other colleagues have also started doing it as a group in different areas as well.
So,
Did I
and when
answer
you
your
talk about
question?
identities, oh, sorry.
Okay.
And when you talk about identities, right? Like I hadn't really thought about it before either, because I was trained by nobody, right? They used to just drop us into crazy places and say, good luck, hope we see you. And miraculously, I made it through. But like thinking about the fact that you're a woman, right? Thinking about the fact that you might be gay, thinking about the fact that you might be a mother, these multiple identities that we hold, right? And how those identities can be targeted by certain groups. And then also that process for doing the risk assessment before you go in, like I had heard about that. I was just like, oh, I got an assignment to go cover this war, this protest, but never sat down and just went over the protocol. It was like, you have to hire a guard in Somalia, or this person in Sudan, or this person in Mumbai, or, whatever. And I just can't tell you how powerful the approach that you have created is, and how helpful it's going to be for everyone kind of going forward.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's really, really important to really think about everyone's identity and the intersectionality of it all and how it really affects us, because, safety is also just this growing concern for all of us. And it's also something that I'm really glad that we're talking about now. And we're also trying to preemptively talk about it before a lot of more stuff happens. Yeah.
And we're on the heels of what's going to promising literally to be we're in the midst of a very challenging time for thousands and thousands of people here, and definitely not here, abroad. And we're going to head into, in this country here, an election phase that's going to be pretty, I can just, we can all just say it right now, probably pretty full of tumultuous activity, and I just appreciate the notion of identity, and like going to these different conventions and things like that. If you're a person of color and you're at this convention, you could be in danger. If you're a person wearing this color at this convention, they might misconstrue it as something, and you would be targeted there. Just even the idea of the different colors that you would wear, or even the helmets, right, that you have on, covering a protest, and how this helmet like signifies paramilitary. This helmet, wear a pink helmet, right? No one wears pink helmets, so you can maybe not be targeted or mistaken for either, someone who's going to storm the Capitol, or someone who is on the opposite end of that spectrum.
Definitely.
How did you come up with all of that? I mean, did you just think about it and it made sense to you? Like, I was just curious about the origin of that.
I think collaboratively everyone didn't know that they were already doing it,
Oh, yeah. So you kind of created the language for it.
Yeah, I think it's really more just spelling it out, because we kind of do it on a daily basis, and then just saying how can we really express this better so that more and more people can think about safety in this way. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the trainings were definitely done by white paramilitary men, and were geared towards having white paramilitary men who were basically journalists, right, and photojournalists for the longest time, right, for them to be safe. And there was never kind of a revision around when women started getting involved, and women of color and people of various sexual identities and things like that, because that didn't necessarily wasn't out in the open for very many decades before.
Yeah, and I also think that the old kind of model like
Yeah.
hindered people from getting safety training, because people will always think, oh, I just need to go to war to be able to try to access something like that, when it's very, very important information to think about your safety in general. Like, like I think nowadays anything that we do can have people harass us digitally, follow us to our home, all of these things, but we never really thought about our own safety in general, because we always had the only comparison that people should care about before was conflict coverage, when now we brought like I throwing in identity and being more trauma aware about it kind of opens this gate that everybody should get access to it now. Yeah, just also
And it's okay to get access to it, right? Because again, there was a stigma before where it was like, oh, I don't need safety training, and I'm really thankful for the upcoming generations being like, oh, yes, I do. I do need safety training. Whereas before it was kind of like, oh, I'm a woman, I got to prove myself. And, with all of these guys that I could be there with them and hold up, when in actuality, that wasn't always the case, and it probably wasn't the safest mentality for me or my colleagues to have, Awesome. Kate, did you have any more questions, or Harry, Jonathan, Neela? Anybody?
No, just thank you, Rosem. It was fabulous to see your photographs, and just very, very thought-provoking. I think when I think of the unsafety of journalists around the world, and that the work there is important, but then your images touch our hearts and really, really tell a story that needs to be told. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
You can really see, like, I love looking at images where the person is looking at the person photographing them, and you can see the connection that you have with them, which is not usual, right? I just want to offer you that. It's very clear that you're connected. You're connecting with the people you're photographing.
And it really ties in with that idea of telling the larger story, which I think is that's the point.